About a year ago, the speaker, city council speaker, called for the creation of this commission that is actually called the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, right? And some people called it the Rikers Commission, some of us called it the Lippman Commission, but call on this commission and ask Judge Lippman to lead it to create a blueprint for criminal justice in the city, and then particularly looking at the question of Rikers Island and should we close Rikers Island? And gave a year to do this. I guess about a month or so ago, someone came up to me and said, how did you do this? Like a professional criminal justice person, experienced person was like, in a year, how did you put this together? Not just the report, but the whole thing. And certainly the process of the commission itself is something that I think is worth taking time to kind of learn a little bit about. But we'll start with Greg, and wanted to ask you, how did this all start?
The first thing we did was we were part of the kitchen cabinet helping to decide who would be on the commission. And I think the great strength of the commission was first and foremost Judge Lippman and his reputation and his kind of savvy, but also the 27 members, and we can quibble at the margins, but basically it's like a bulletproof list of people that's incredibly diverse along all different kinds of lines. And so I think we chose more or less the right commissioners at the end of the day, and each of whom brought their own gravitas and institutional heft and credibility to the table. So that was one role that we played.
Thinking about the public engagement strategy, the communication strategy, what was in your minds when you were trying to leverage the commission's heft? What were you thinking about how to do that?
I think from a communications standpoint, we wanted to identify where like the really controversial issues were going to be, and then work to spend the year putting stories out there that would soften the ground. We wanted to tell these personal stories. We really wanted to humanize it so people really understood. Everyone knows Rikers is terrible, but when you hear it first person from these voices, it really makes a difference. And so we tried to work to get those stories into the press.
When we look back and kind of think about a strategy, the strategy was to kind of allow people who felt marginalized and to give them a voice with like an audience that they would probably not have on their own. So we were very kind of strict to that, to making sure that everyone had a voice. It didn't matter when, how. Our community roundtables, for example, we said it was going to end at 8, it ended at 9, 9:15, 9:30, right? Because we wanted to make sure that everyone had a voice and everyone felt like they were heard. And I think a lot of times with a lot of these kind of campaigns, issue-based campaigns, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to speak, right? You're just kind of rallying, and no one ever gets to kind of speak and to be heard.
Can I ask about what your and Nick's strategy was hurting the commission members through this process?
We actually didn't have to do a ton of just sort of educating about the New York City criminal justice system because these folks all knew it. There were moments where we really sort of insisted that the commissioners in the subcommittee sort of be willing to engage and come up with recommendations, even where it felt like there was a lot of tension, specifically around bail and pretrial reform. It's part of a larger sort of conversation that's happening in New York City and New York State about our bail statute. So we weren't afraid to wrestle with the points of contention. And I think we learned over time in the first couple of months, where do we need to drill down and spend more time, and where can we just say we know that everybody agrees with this and we can sort of check that off and move on.
So Meg Egan with CUNY's Institute for State and Local Governance, and Meg was the staff lead for the second subcommittee, which is the future of jails, looking at the jails of tomorrow. So Meg, tell a little bit about how you came into this.
My background is I've spent what is a lifetime in government, mostly around criminal justice and poverty policy in Chicago and here in New York, and the last couple of years that I was in Chicago, I worked at the Cook County Jail, doing more than jail work, but spent a lot of time at the jail. And so our strategy for this was sort of trying to meet this tension between how do you blue sky this problem? How do you think about being as aspirational as possible while being realistic? But also, how do you come up with a fiscal plan to make this thing realistic? So the fiscal plan was a really important part of of what we put together, because we knew that the population questions were going to be a thing, where you put the jails were going to be a thing, but how you pay for this was also going to be a big thing. And so what we did was we laid out a fiscal plan that outlined the cost, the sort of upfront cost, but also the savings that you would see if you went into a much smaller, more effective system.
You know, what's so interesting about all of this is that you're not criminal justice people. Tell us how you guys got kind of your backgrounds, and how Forest City kind of got involved in this, and then what your strategy was for tackling your piece of this pie.
So in full disclosure, I am a planner, but this criminal justice issue is very close to my heart and in my bone marrow, really, because my father was the first chair of Vera. Herb Sturz gave me my first job in New York City as a planner. My sister is on the board of Vera. And this was sort of my opportunity to become immersed in criminal justice, things that have been in my family and been very close to my heart and my brain for a long time. So it was like a perfect, wonderful world for me. But what's really interesting is that everybody on the commission, because they're all steeped in criminal justice, nobody knew what the hell to think about a land use, plan or a master plan or anything. So everything was open, and it became pretty quickly, there were some things that became very clear very early on, like there is no adaptive reuse of the buildings on Rikers Island. They cannot be reused for anything. So they need to be demolished. And the other was that there's no access to the island. So first we looked at that as the biggest limiting factor, and yet it became one of the decisive planning issues on the opposite side, because the public would have had to invest billions and billions of dollars in mass transportation to create any reuse on that island, even though it's 413 acres of land in New York City. I mean, if you think about it that way, it's astonishing. And it turned out that the remoteness of the island also became the reason why we came to our recommendations, which is not to create residential communities or academic communities or things where the public would have to try to get there. It was basically for infrastructure, for expanding LaGuardia, for allowing next-gen infrastructure, for DEP, for wastewater, for sustainability. All of that land can be used for those things. And those things, by the way, are not easy to cite in New York.
I love what we proposed in the end, because I feel like the solution that we proposed in the end, which is infrastructure, which we all are also talking about it a lot more nowadays, because we need to be able to open our faucet at our house and have clean water come out of it, right? But right now, the infrastructure is so old in the country as a whole that it's something that I think is coming to the mind in general. And I think that our solution, which we came up with two solutions, one was an extension of LaGuardia Airport with a possible water treatment plant, a compost facility that would be able to use all the compost, and a solar energy field. So we're really kind of doing what does New York City need in order to sustain its growth in the next 50 years? What are these things that can be done?
Meg, can I come back to you? What is something that you felt most strongly about should be in the report? What was an idea that you wanted to champion?
One of the really important things to me was what are sort of the philosophical principles that we are recommending in designing these new facilities. Jails are horrible places. They're horrible places for people who work there and for people who are held. And so we wanted to make sure that we were thoughtful about sort of how the buildings would be designed. So there's a term called direct supervision. So direct supervision is you design the jail, and I don't know how many people have actually been in a jail, but the old design is sort of long linear corridors with cells on either side, which means that you don't have dedicated programming space. And so direct supervision is this idea where you communication skills for officers are paramount. Like, they can't sort of be out of sight, out of mind. So we cared a lot about direct supervision. We cared a lot about direct programming space. We cared a lot about natural light, natural fixtures, features, and dedicated medical and mental health space, so that we could, again, so that the facilities were humane and effective and safe for everyone who's there.
We wanted this to be blue sky, but we didn't want it to be dead on arrival. And so we knew that the siting was always going to be an issue, because no council member wants to run and have a jail being built in their district. And something happened that early on is Councilmember Chin and Steve Levin, who have jails in their communities, and they had nothing but positive things to say.
I wanted to just quickly ask Mike to talk about another small recommendation, but big in the report, which we put into the chapter called Moving Forward. And it was about sort of honoring the legacy and history of Rikers Island and what to do going forward. And Mike was this like radicalized champion.
I would just say that symbols matter. We can't have a Rikers Island anymore. It's got to be named something else that symbolizes rebirth. Number two, we can't erase history. So it seemed as though a memorial and a museum that would provoke a conversation would be important. So that was where I came at it. I know Glenn Martin and others similarly felt this was important. It was part of the final plan.
A big part, and this is something that Nick and I, the head of Vera, shared, was a desire for this report to really be a visionary blueprint document that would generate momentum for a host of reforms, whether or not Rikers actually closes. If you get into the weeds, and I do encourage you to read the document, there's a host of reforms that would, whether, again, we should close Rikers Island, but even if we don't, if we enacted these 44 reforms, we would have a better criminal justice system. And so I feel like we've set a North Star, not just for the Center for Court Innovation, but I would argue for the criminal justice system as a whole, that I think is going to reverberate over the next decade.
One of the things that's amazing about the report is it's less about criminal justice really than it is about sort of good stewardship of public resources and for all New Yorkers. And that's what I think is so powerful about what we harnessed in the report and the sentiment. And I think it's that sentiment that will carry forward in actually closing Rikers.
Thank you guys for staying, and also thank you to my friends and colleagues for all of your work. It's been such a pleasure working with you guys. Thank you.